I was face down in frost-crusted gravel when I realized the radio was still whispering my name. Not out loud. Not in a voice anyone else could hear over the distant thump of outgoing artillery and the constant, tired wind off the ridge, but in that thin, electric hiss that sits right under the squelch like a secret you weren't meant to catch. The handset was jammed under my shoulder, antenna bent, screens spiderweb from the fall, and still it kept pulsing. My call sign, my actual last name, the one nobody in my platoon used, because nobody used real names downrange if they could help it. I remember thinking, with the kind of stupid clarity you only get when everything is going wrong at once, that this was exactly how a horror movie starts, except the monster is paperwork and friendly fire and the part of your brain that never learned when to shut up. Behind me, on the narrow goat trail we'd been climbing for the last 40 minutes, someone was crying without making a sound, the way you do when you're trying not to give away your position. Somewhere to my left, our new lieutenant was trying to crawl backward, which is a ridiculous thing to do on a slope like that, but panic makes you invent physics. And right in front of me, half buried in scrub and old snow, the tripwire I just hooked with my boot quivered like a plucked guitar string and then went slack, which meant one of two things. Either I gotten insanely lucky, or whoever laid it had built it a trigger after the wire released. I didn't have time to decide, which because the ground under my chest vibrated with that deep, sickening metallic click that lives in every infantryman's nightmares, the kind you feel in your bones more than hear. I froze so hard my teeth hurt. The problem with freezing is you can't freeze the rest of the world with you, and the rest of the world kept moving. The wind kept pushing the smell of cordite uphill. The ridge kept looming like a dark jawline against a washed-out winter sky, and the radio kept whispering, patient as a priest. I try to think in checklists because that's what they train you to do, but my brain had already started slipping into the other mode, the one it would return to years later in my kitchen when a dropped spoon sounded like a magazine hitting concrete. I could feel my heart punching the dirt, and I could feel the pressure of my plate carrier digging into my ribs, and I could feel the stupid weight of the knowledge that I've been the senior guy on point because my squad leader trusted me, and because I've been doing this long enough that the fear had gotten quieter, and because I promised my wife in a video call with a lag so bad it made her smile look like it belonged to a stranger, that I was going to bring everyone back from this rotation. All of that was true until the wire twitched. The explosion didn't happen right away, which was worse, because it gave my mind time to fill in possibilities. I pictured a pressure plate I couldn't see, a battery pack under the snow, a command detonator watching us through binoculars from the ridge. I pictured the paperwork they'd do if I got 3 guys killed on a patrol that was supposed to be presence and reassurance, which is what they called it when they didn't want to admit we were just walking around, so the locals could see we weren't hiding behind Hesco all day. And then, because my brain has always been the kind to double down on cruelty when it's under stress, I pictured the lieutenant's face when he'd briefed us an hour earlier, all earnest and fresh, like he'd been issued optimism right alongside his map. He'd been talking about rules of engagement and minimizing escalation, and I've been looking at his hands, clean and pale in the cold, thinking about how some people arrive to war like it's a seminar. There was a second click, closer this time like a spring setting. Something in me snapped into motion. I lifted my head just enough to see the wire's anchor point, a crude, not around a bent nail hammered into a rock, and below it a shallow scrape in the snow leading off to a lump that didn't look like a rock at all, just a slightly too regular mound under a dusting of white. My mouth went dry. I reached out slowly, fingers numb even through gloves, and tried to trace the line without tugging it. The radio hissed again, and this time I caught more than my name, coordinates spoken too fast, and then a phrase that didn't belong on our net. It sounded like a weather report at first, the cadence wrong, but then the words arranged themselves in my head. Return package. Return package. That meant nothing to me in that moment, but it lodged there like a splinter. Behind me, someone shifted a boot scraping stone, and the lieutenant inhaled sharply. I wanted to scream at them to stop moving, but you don't scream on a ridgeline in enemy country unless you want the universe to answer. So I did the only thing I could do. I crawled forward, 1 inch at a time, weight off my boot, trying to get close enough to see the device without setting it off. The mound wasn't a rock. It was a body, or what used to be one, wrapped in an old blanket stiff with ice. A hand protruded from the edge, skin blackened by cold and time, fingers frozen in a half clench like it had died holding on to something important. The tripwire ran under the blanket. My stomach turned because there's a special kind of wrongness to using a dead person as camouflage, even for people who've seen enough wrongness that they've learned to file it away and keep moving. I leaned closer, and the radio whispered my name again, softer, almost tender, like it had been waiting until I was near the body to speak clearly. I didn't want to look under the blanket, but I did, because you don't get to look away in my line of work. Under the dead man's ribs, wired to the bone like a grotesque necklace, was a phone battery pack and a crude detonator. And tucked beside it, pressed against the corpse's sternum, was a laminated card in a plastic sleeve, the kind we issue to new guys with basic phrases in the local language. Except this one wasn't in the local language. It was in English. It was one of ours. It had my unit's patch printed in the corner like a watermark. And across the top, in block letters that looked like they'd been stamped by someone who wanted it to survive weather and fire and time. It said, "If you are reading this, they already brought you back." I don't remember deciding to breathe again, but air forced its way back into my lungs like my body had vetoed my brain, and with it came the cold clarity that the card wasn't a prank and wasn't planted for just anyone. It had my unit patch, sure, but more than that, it had the tiny misprint from our first deployment run, the threadbare corner detail only guys who'd worn the damn thing for months would recognize, and that meant someone on the inside had made it or someone had taken the time to copy it perfectly, which was somehow worse. I eased the blanket back into place with shaking hands, every nerve screaming that I was about to die over a corpse that already had, and crawled backward until my pack snagged on scrub, and I almost laughed from the pressure of holding it all in. I signaled the squad to stay frozen, and for once they listened without hesitation, because fear has a way of making rank irrelevant. The radio crackled again, and this time I shut it off hard, thumb digging into the power button like I could bruise the thing into silence. But the whisper didn't stop right away, echoing in my head even after the screen went dark. I remember thinking about how many times I'd warned my guys not to anthropomorphize their gear, not to curse radios or thank rifles or talk to vehicles like they were people, because that way leads to superstition, and superstition gets you killed. And there I was, arguing with a dead handset while my heart tried to escape my chest. We couldn't disarm it without an EOD kit we didn't have, and we couldn't bypass it because the wire webbed out under the snow in a pattern that made my skin crawl with its deliberate complexity. So we did what infantry has always done when faced with something smarter than brute force. We backed away slowly and marked the danger, and pretended control was the same thing as safety. The lieutenant wanted to reroute, his eyes wide, his jaw tight with the effort of not vomiting, and I nodded because there was nothing else to do, but all the while that line on the card kept replaying itself, a looped recording that refused to degrade. If you were reading this, they already brought you back. The rest of the patrol blurred into muscle memory. Spacing, security halts, the constant scanning of angles and shadows. But my mind was elsewhere, inventorying memories like a supply cage after a fire. I started noticing gaps, not the dramatic kind you hear about in movies, but small omissions that felt wrong only because of how ordinary they were. The first time I'd met my squad leader on my first deployment, for example, I could picture the motor pool, the heat shimmering off concrete, the smell of diesel and dust, but his face in that memory slid away like a bad render. Later, when we were back behind the wire and the adrenaline had ebbed enough to leave us hollow, one of the guys asked me if I was okay, and I gave him a standard answer because that's what you do, but inside I was cataloging the way his voice sounded both familiar and slightly off, like a song you know by heart played at the wrong speed. I didn't tell anyone about the card. I didn't tell anyone about the radio whispering my name after I'd killed it. I told myself it was stress, that combat makes your brain do weird things, that the dead don't write notes, and the army doesn't hide messages in corpses. That night, lying on my cot with my boots still on because the day had wrung me out too hard to care, I dreamed I was back home in my kitchen, sunlight slanting across the counter, my wife standing at the sink with her hair pulled back the way she did when she was concentrating. She turned to me and smiled, and for a split second everything felt right, until she opened her mouth and spoke in the same flat cadence as the radio, repeating my name like a checksum. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart hammering, convinced someone was standing over me. No one was. But on the footlocker at the end of my cot, neatly stacked with my spare socks like it had always been there, was a laminated card in a plastic sleeve, edges scuffed, patch in the corner misprinted, just so, and this time the line underneath was different. It read, "Stop pretending you don't remember the first time you died." I sat there for a long time, staring at the card like it might blink first, my hands locked around the edge of the cot, so hard my fingers went numb. Because the worst part wasn't the message itself, but the way it felt familiar, like a punchline I'd heard before and forgotten on purpose. I checked the footlocker for signs of tampering, even though that made no sense. Ran my fingers along the seams of the tent, listened for footsteps outside, All the usual rituals you perform when your sense of reality starts to fray, and you want to prove to yourself that at least the physical world still follows rules. The card was real. The plastic was scratched, the laminate peeling at one corner, and when I rubbed my thumb over the printed ink, it didn't smear, which meant it hadn't just been dreamed into existence. I shoved it into my cargo pocket and told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, which is the lie everyone tells right before things get worse. The next day brought a patrol cancellation and a command visit, which should have been unrelated but felt connected in the way everything starts to feel connected when paranoia digs in. A colonel I'd never seen before walked through our area with a small entourage, nodding, asking about morale, his eyes skimming over us like he was checking serial numbers. When he shook my hand, his grip lingered a fraction of a second too long, and his gaze sharpened in a way that made the hair on my arm stand up, like he was confirming something internally. After he moved on, I realized I couldn't remember his name, even though he'd introduced himself twice, and that bothered me more than the visit itself. The day crawled. Little things kept going wrong in ways that were easy to dismiss if you weren't already on edge. A radio that reset itself to an old frequency. A patrol log with my handwriting in it for a day. I was sure I'd been on rest. A joke from one of the guys referencing a story I didn't recall telling, but that everyone else laughed at like it was a classic. I started testing myself, mentally flipping through memories like flashcards, and every time I hit a deployment milestone, first firefight, first casualty, first letter home, I felt a pressure in my head like something pushing back. That afternoon, alone in the latrine with the distant thud of helicopters passing overhead, I finally let myself read the card again. The word hadn't changed, but on the back, in smaller print I hadn't noticed before, there was a date. It wasn't from this deployment or the last one. It was from a year I couldn't place, a gap between tours that in my official records was filled with training and leave and nothing remarkable. I tried to remember that year and came up with fragments. A white room that smelled like antiseptic, a ceiling with hairline cracks arranged like a map, voices arguing softly behind glass. None of it lined up with the story I told people about that time, the one where I'd gone home, reconnected, reset. When I left the latrine, my squad leader pulled me aside, his face tight, and asked me if I was feeling off, said I'd been listed as present for an op 3 months ago that I'd sworn I'd missed because of a busted ankle. He said it like a joke, but his eyes searched my face for a reaction. I laughed it off because that's what you do when the alternative is admitting you don't trust your own mind, but inside something cracked. That night, instead of sleeping, I sat with my back against the cot and let the memories come, pushing past the resistance until it hurt. I saw it then, not as a dream, but as a hard-edged recollection. A convoy, a flash, the world turning inside out as an explosion lifted our vehicle like a toy and slammed it back down. Pain so total it went white. Hands on my chest, someone screaming for a medic, and then nothing. After that, the white room, the ceiling, the voices. One of them saying my name the way the radio did, not asking if I could hear him, but telling me I would. I doubled over, gagging, because the realization landed with the weight of a confession you can't take back. I didn't remember the first time I died because I hadn't been meant to. And somewhere out there, someone had decided to remind me. Once you admit to yourself that you've died, the rest of the lies start to look sloppy, like a stage set you can see from the wrong angle. I moved through the next few days with a kind of detached focus, doing everything by rote while my attention tunneled inward, replaying that half-remembered white room and the calm certainty in the voice that had told me I would hear him. I started noticing patterns that I couldn't unsee. Every time I passed certain areas of the base, my head throbbed in a way that felt less like a headache and more like pressure, as if something inside me was reacting to an invisible signal. The motor pool was the worst. The moment I stepped between the rows of armored vehicles, a high-pitched whine crept into my ears, and I had to grip a cold steel bumper to keep my knees from buckling. I told myself it was tinnitus, blast exposure, the 1,000 small injuries that add up over a career, but that explanation fell apart when the whine synced with the radios powering up around me, rising and falling in perfect, unnatural unison. I started avoiding comms when I could, delegating radio checks, volunteering for tasks that kept me busy with my hands and away from electronics. It didn't help. The whispers came anyway, not constant, but persistent enough to feel intentional, surfacing when I was alone or distracted, always using my name like a key. The worst part was that they weren't threatening. They were reassuring. They talked about progress, about stabilization, about how well I was integrating compared to the others, and every time I caught a phrase like that, my stomach dropped because I didn't know who the others were supposed to be. I finally cracked and went to medical framing it as sleep issues and headaches, because that's the script we're all taught, and the PA nodded sympathetically and ran me through the motions. When he pulled up my file, his brow furrowed for just a second before smoothing out, and he scrolled faster than necessary, like he was skimming past something he didn't want to dwell on. He prescribed painkillers and told me to hydrate, and when I left the aid station, I realized my hands were shaking from something that had nothing to do with caffeine. That night, the card was back on my footlocker, even though I'd hidden it deep in my ruck under a spare uniform. This time there were more words, printed in the same blocky font, the tone almost conversational. It said, "We didn't expect you to notice so soon. Most of you don't." It went on to talk about survivability rates, about how modern medicine had plateaued and needed help, about how experience was too valuable to lose to chance. Reading it felt like eavesdropping on a briefing I'd never been cleared for, one that treated lives like variables in an equation. At the bottom was a simple instruction: check your dog tags. I didn't want to. I knew that if I checked them, something fundamental would shift from suspicion to certainty. And there's a moment in every story where the protagonist stands on that line and pretends there's still a way back. I told myself I'd do it later, that I needed sleep, that I was spiraling. Instead, I lay there staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the distant hum of generators, until the need to know outweighed the fear. My tags felt heavier than they should have when I pulled them out from under my shirt. The top one was standard issue, my name, my blood type, my religious preference. The bottom one wasn't. It had the same name, but underneath it, in smaller letters, was a string of characters I didn't recognize, followed by a word that made my breath catch: Iteration 3. I sat there in the dark, the weight of those words pressing down on me, because iteration implies repetition, and repetition implies failure. Somewhere beyond the wire, something had decided I was worth bringing back more than once. Once you know you're on your third iteration, you start wondering what happened to the first two, and that's not a safe line of thought for anyone who still has to function in a combat zone. I try to compartmentalize it the way we're taught, boxing up the fear and the questions and shoving them into a mental locker I promised myself I'd open later, but the boxes kept rattling. I watched my guys more closely, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a desperate need to anchor myself to something real, and the result was worse than if I'd found nothing. A few of them showed the same subtle tells I'd started to recognize in myself. Momentary blank stares when a memory was referenced, flinches when certain frequencies crackled over the net, the way they avoided mirrors without realizing it. Others seemed untouched, blissfully unaware, which created a quiet divide that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. I started pulling old manifests and casualty reports under the guise of helping the lieutenant with planning, cross-referencing dates and names, and the pattern that emerged made my skin crawl. Every miraculous recovery, every soldier who'd been written up as a survivor against the odds, clustered around the same units, the same rotations, the same regions. We were the control group, and the experiment rolled into one. The realization didn't come with cinematic flair, just a dull, creeping certainty that settled in my gut and refused to leave. The whispers grew more insistent after that, like they could sense my attention sharpening. They stopped using my name as much and started using we, talking about continuity and resilience and how the program, always the program, never a name, relied on soldiers who could adapt. They framed it like a compliment, like I should be proud to be part of something bigger than myself. But all I could hear was the unspoken corollary: parts can be replaced. I finally confronted one of the guys I trusted, not directly, just probing, asking about a training exercise from years back that I knew we'd both been on. He described it confidently, down to details I knew were wrong. And when I gently corrected him, he laughed it off, but his eyes flickered with the same panic I'd felt in the latrine. That was the moment I realized none of us could trust our memories, not fully, and that whatever had brought us back had also edited us for compatibility. The card appeared again that night, because of course it did, and this time it felt less like a warning and more like a nudge. It talked about mission readiness, about how emotional destabilization was a known side effect that usually resolved with time. It reassured me that I wasn't disposable, that each iteration was an improvement, a refinement based on data gathered in the field. I found myself angry at that, at the implication that I was a draft, a work in progress that could be tweaked without my consent. At the bottom, there was a new line, almost casual: sometimes they come back wrong. That sentence followed me into the next day, into a patrol that went sideways faster than anyone expected. We were moving through a village we'd walked a dozen times before when the world tilted, that same pressure blooming in my head, and I knew something was about to happen before the first shot cracked. I dove for cover on instinct, dragging one of my guys with me, and a heartbeat later the alley behind us erupted in gunfire. It was over quick, messy but contained, the kind of contact that barely rates a mention in a debrief, except for one detail no one else seemed to notice. The shooter, a local kid no older than 16, went down hard, and when I rolled him to check for explosives, his eyes were wide and glassy and fixed on me with recognition that had nothing to do with fear. His lips moved as he bled out, forming words I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears, but I didn't need to. I knew what he was saying because I'd heard it before, whispered through static in the cold. My name? I staggered back, ball rising, because that meant whatever this was, it wasn't just us. The program didn't stop at uniforms. After that patrol, the base felt smaller, like the walls had inched closer when no one was looking, and every face I passed carried the uncomfortable question of whether they were watching me or waiting for me to break. I couldn't get the kid's eyes out of my head. The way recognition had flared there without confusion, like he'd been briefed on me, like I was a known quantity in his last moments. I started cataloging anomalies the way you'd log maintenance issues on a vehicle, because turning fear into data was the only way I knew how to survive it. Certain locations triggered stronger reactions. Certain times of day brought the whispers closer to the surface, and certain people, usually the ones with spotless records and eerily calm demeanors, seemed to exist just slightly out of sync with everyone else. The lieutenant was one of them. I watched him during briefings, noticed how his eyes tracked information instead of people, how he never seemed surprised by bad news. When orders came down rerouting us to a sector that had been quiet for months, he accepted it without comment, and something in my gut twisted because quiet sectors don't stay quiet without a reason. I started sleeping in short bursts, afraid of what I'd remember if I let my guard down, and that's when the dreams changed. They stopped being fragments and started being sequences, cohesive enough to hurt. I saw myself on a gurney, chest torn open, machines humming softly around me, a team working with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this too many times. I heard terms I didn't understand then, but did now, references to neural mapping and memory overlays, someone remarking that Iteration 2 had been promising but unstable under sustained stress. In the dream, I tried to speak and couldn't, and the voice I'd heard through the radio leaned close and told me not to fight it, that compliance reduced degradation. I woke up with my jaw clenched so hard it ached, and the taste of copper in my mouth. The card was there again, because of course it was, and this time it didn't bother with reassurance. It told me about scope, about how conflict zones provided ideal test environments, because chaos masked variables, about how local populations were integrated at lower fidelity to observe long-term behavioral drift. It framed it all in the language of necessity, of survival of the species, and I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized the war wasn't just a backdrop, it was the lab. I thought about the kid, about the way his last word had been my name, and wondered how many times he died before he learned it. I decided then that pretending ignorance was no longer an option. If this thing used soldiers because we were already conditioned to follow orders and accept loss, then the only leverage I had was the same thing they were exploiting: experience. I started paying attention to the whispers instead of shutting them out, letting them talk, letting them assume compliance, and what I learned scared me more than the truth ever could. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as custodians, correcting errors, pruning timelines. And they were confident because no iteration had ever gone rogue for long. That night, as I sat alone, cleaning my rifle with unnecessary thoroughness, the radio on the table beside me powered on by itself, volume low, and the voice came through clear for the first time, not layered with static or coded language. It told me I'd been selected for reintegration, that my current deployment had reached its usefulness, and that arrangements were already in motion. I stared at the dark radio face and felt a grim calm settle over me. Because if they thought they were bringing me back again, they were wrong. I wasn't going quietly this time. Once you decide you're not going quietly, everything sharpens into a terrible, beautiful focus, the kind I used to get right before contact when the world narrowed down to angles and timing and breath. I started acting exactly the way they seemed to expect, nodding at orders, volunteering for tasks, letting the whispers wash over me without resistance, so they'd mistake my attention for acceptance. Inside, I was mapping the system the way you map an enemy position, noting entry points and blind spots, figuring out where the confidence turned into complacency. Reintegration, I learned, wasn't extraction in the traditional sense. There were no helicopters or convoys. No dramatic midnight movements. It was a handoff, quiet and procedural, triggered when an iteration showed signs of divergence beyond acceptable parameters. A medical evac justified on paper by headaches and sleep deprivation. A transfer to a rear facility with the right equipment. A white room. The same white room. I realized then that the base itself was a funnel, that the pressure points I'd felt weren't accidents, but guide rails nudging me toward compliance. The motor pool, the aid station, the comms hub, they weren't just places, they were checkpoints. I started avoiding them deliberately, using runners instead of radios, feigning stubborn old-school habits that made me look like a cranky NCO instead of a liability. It bought me time, but not much. The lieutenant started checking on me more often, his concern perfectly calibrated, and I could feel the net tightening. Meanwhile, the dreams escalated into something like memories bleeding through a wound. I saw Iteration 1 die, screaming in a fireball on a road I could almost name. I saw Iteration 2 survive longer, make it home, start to ask questions, and end up on that same gurney with disappointment heavy in the room. The implication was clear. I wasn't the first version of me to think about fighting back. I just might be the first to stay angry enough to try. The whispers shifted tone as my scheduled reintegration approached, less patient now, more directive, reminding me of duty, of the people I'd endanger by resisting. That's when I knew they were worried, because guilt is a tool you only reach for when authority isn't enough. On the day it happened, the excuse was routine. I collapsed during a briefing, did a convincing enough job that even the part of me still clinging to denial almost believed it, and the medevac wheels started turning faster than I'd hoped. As they loaded me into the vehicle, strapped down and surrounded by the familiar controlled chaos of trained professionals, I caught the lieutenant's eye. For the first time, his mask slipped, and what looked back at me wasn't concern or authority, but assessment, like I was a malfunctioning component being sent for repair. The ride blurred into a tunnel of noise and motion, and I focused on the one thing I'd managed to smuggle with me, the laminated card tucked into my sleeve where no one had thought to check. As the sedative crept into my veins, the whispers rose to a chorus, confident and soothing, promising rest, promising a reset. I smiled to myself, because they'd made one critical mistake. They'd taught me how the process worked, and they'd assumed I wanted to survive it. The last thing I saw before the world went white was the ceiling of the transport, and the last thing I thought was that if iteration meant repetition, then failure could go both ways. Waking up wasn't like opening your eyes after sleep. It was like being poured back into yourself, awareness seeping in around the edges until it hurt. The white room was exactly as I'd remembered it, down to the hairline cracks in the ceiling that my mind had traced into maps during previous days, and the smell of antiseptic layered over something metallic that never quite went away. I couldn't move at first, restraints pinning me in place with clinical efficiency, and for a moment panic flared before I forced it down, because panic was what they expected. The whispers were louder here, not confined to radios or half-heard static, but embedded in the hum of machines, overlapping voices discussing my vitals and my progress, as if I were a chart instead of a person. They talked about divergence and stress thresholds, about how Iteration 3 had exceeded projections in some areas and failed in others, and I listened, cataloging, waiting. The trick, I realized, was that they still needed me conscious for certain phases, still needed my brain to cooperate long enough to map itself. They couldn't just wipe and reload like a hard drive without losing the very thing they valued: experience. So I gave them what they wanted, compliance on the surface, letting my thoughts slow, letting my breathing even out, playing the role of a soldier who'd finally accepted rest. Inside, I focused on the one variable they couldn't fully control: intent. The card was gone when I checked, a flicker of anger slicing through my calm. But then I felt it, not physically, but as a pressure in my awareness, like a bookmark placed in my mind. They hadn't taken it. They'd integrated it. I understood then that the cards had never been just physical prompts. They were memory anchors, fail-safes designed to surface awareness when certain conditions were met. Someone, somewhere in the system, had wanted me to wake up. I remembered the voice leaning close in my earlier dreams, the subtle difference in tone from the others, the way it had said my name like it mattered. That voice came back now, quieter than the rest, guiding me through the process without their knowledge, telling me when to let go and when to hold on. It showed me glimpses of the network behind the program, not faces or names, but flows of data and authority, a lattice of decisions justified by necessity and insulated by secrecy. It showed me the flaw, too, the reliance on iterations that could be predicted. As the machine interfacing with my skull ramped up, I did the one thing they didn't expect. I reached outward, not inward, pushing my awareness along the same channels they used to monitor me, piggybacking on the process like a stowaway. For a heartbeat, the whispers faltered, confusion rippling through the chorus, and in that gap, I made a choice that felt like jumping off a cliff. I didn't try to escape alone. I opened the door. I broadcast everything I was, every memory they tried to curate, every doubt and fracture, into the wider system. The pain was indescribable, like being flayed from the inside, and alarms screamed as something went catastrophically wrong. In the chaos, I felt other presences stir, other iterations, other people who'd been sleeping behind layers of compliance and editing. The white room shook, lights flickering, and for the first time since this had started, the whispers weren't in control. As darkness surged back in, I didn't know if I'd won or doomed us all, only that whatever woke up with me wouldn't go back to sleep easily. I came back to consciousness in pieces, sensations drifting in without context, the ache first, then the cold, then the unmistakable smell of burning insulation that dragged me fully awake, because nothing good ever smells like that. The white room was wrecked, lights shattered, one wall scorched black as if something had tried to claw its way out, and the machines that had once hummed with quiet authority now screamed intermittently like wounded animals. I was no longer restrained, not because someone had freed me, but because the mounts themselves had been torn loose, twisted metal curled outward as if pried apart by something desperate and strong. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low, dissonant noise that felt more like static flooding my skull than voices forming words, and underneath it all was a new sensation I'd never felt before: company. Not the abstract sense of being observed, but the visceral awareness of other minds brushing against mine, raw and unfiltered, each carrying their own confusion, anger, and dawning horror. I staggered to my feet, legs shaking, and caught my reflection in a fractured mirror panel, half expecting not to recognize myself. The face staring back was mine, older than it should have been, eyes too sharp, like they'd finally focused after years of blur. Memories flooded in uninvited now, not just mine but fragments of others, different deaths, different lives, overlapping deployments in hospital rooms and white ceilings. Enough to make me gag as I braced myself against the wall. Somewhere beyond the room, alarms wailed and distant shouting echoed, the sound of a system realizing it was bleeding out. I knew, with a certainty that bypassed logic, that what I'd done had propagated outward, slipping through the same channels they'd used to keep us compliant, and that meant the damage wasn't contained. The program thrived on control and predictability, and I just introduced chaos at scale. As I stumbled down a corridor lit by emergency strobes, I passed doors standing open that should have been sealed, glimpses of other rooms where people were waking up the way I had, some screaming, some eerily calm, all of them changed. I understood then why no iteration had ever gone rogue for long. They'd always been isolated. I'd broken isolation. The radio on the wall crackled to life as I passed, and for a moment my heart seized, expecting the familiar cadence. But the voice that came through was panicked, human, shouting orders that no one seemed able to follow. Outside, through a reinforced window, I saw smoke rising from parts of the base that were never supposed to be visible on any map, infrastructure hidden in plain sight, now exposed by failure. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt responsible in a way that made my chest hurt, because whatever came next would spill far beyond me, beyond soldiers and iterations and labs, into a world that had no idea how thin the line really was. As I reached the exit, the static in my head coalesced just enough to form a final, fleeting impression from that quieter voice. Not approval or warning, but something like relief. Then the sensation cut off abruptly, like a cord severed mid-thought, and I stepped out into the night, knowing the program wasn't finished, just wounded, and wounded things don't always die quietly. I'm writing this months later from a place I won't name, on a device that isn't registered to me, because the habit of looking over your shoulder never really goes away once you've learned what watches from behind the walls. Officially, I don't exist anymore. There was an incident classified at every level that matters, a facility failure blamed on experimental power systems and human error, and a handful of names quietly removed from rosters to keep the math clean. Unofficially, I'm not alone. What I triggered didn't end with that night. It fractured the program into something messier and far harder to contain. People woke up, not all at once, not everywhere, but enough that patterns started to break. Some vanished. Some fought. Some went very, very quiet. I've crossed paths with a few of them in the liminal spaces where veterans tend to drift, and there's a look you learn to recognize, a depth behind the eyes that isn't just trauma. We don't talk about it directly, because we don't have to. We share the same gaps, the same intrusive memories that don't quite line up with the stories we tell our families, the same aversion to certain frequencies and certain white rooms we've never seen on any official map. The whispers never came back the way they used to, but sometimes late at night, when everything's still, I catch an echo, not a command or a reassurance, just a sense of distant recalibration, like something out there is still trying to reassert control with fewer pieces on the board. I don't know if what I did saved anyone. I do know it forced a conversation they couldn't keep having in secret, and that alone might have been worth it. The guilt sits heavy, because every iteration was a person, every experiment of life bent into a shape it never consented to, and I was both subject and catalyst. If there's a point to this, if there's a reason I'm putting it out here in the void of the internet, it's not a warning so much as a record. Because secrecy thrives on silence. And because some of you reading this will feel a flicker of recognition you can't explain. If you've ever lost time you can't account for, if you've ever woken up knowing something fundamental had been edited without your permission, pay attention. Check your dog tags. And if you ever hear a voice in the static that knows your name better than you do, don't assume it's there to help you survive. Sometimes surviving is the worst possible outcome.